Various theories exist about where they came from, whether from the mountains to the north after perfecting irrigation agriculture, from regions along the Persian Gulf, or from elsewhere entirely. The archaeological record shows cultural continuity from the earlier Ubaid period, suggesting the transformation may have been gradual rather than the result of a sudden migration. What remains certain is what they accomplished once established in southern Mesopotamia. In the scorching heat of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved their paths through an unforgiving landscape, something extraordinary was happening. Between dusty plains and fertile riverbanks, humanity was taking its first stumbling steps toward what we now call civilization. This wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a slow burn, stretching across millennia. But when it finally ignited, it would illuminate the path for every culture that followed. The people who sparked this revolution called themselves the Black-Headed People. History would come to know them as the Sumerians, and their story begins roughly 7,000 years ago in a land that would become the cradle of human achievement. Around 4,500 BCE, while most of humanity still wandered in small hunting groups, the Sumerians were settling into permanent communities in what is now southern Iraq. They chose a place that seemed impossible to tame. The summers were merciless, the floods unpredictable, and the soil, when dry, turned hard as stone. Yet they saw something others missed: potential. Between the two great rivers lay silt-rich earth that, if properly managed, could yield harvests beyond imagination. But managing this land would require innovation, cooperation, and a level of social organization never before attempted in human history. Before the Sumerians arrived, another mysterious culture had already begun the groundwork. Archaeologists call them the Ubaid people, and they occupied southern Mesopotamia from roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. These proto-civilizers introduced fundamental technologies such as pottery making, basic metalwork with copper, and the earliest forms of irrigation. They built simple temples and established the first permanent villages in the region. When the Sumerians appeared in the historical record, perhaps migrating from the mountains to the north or arriving from some other origin that remains hotly debated, they absorbed these Ubaid innovations and expanded them beyond recognition. The Sumerian language itself offers few clues to their origins. It's generally recognized as a language isolate in linguistics, meaning it belongs to no known language family and has no clear relatives among ancient or modern tongues. This uniqueness has fueled endless speculation. Some scholars have proposed connections to Uralic languages like Hungarian and Finnish, while others have suggested links to various language families. But none of these theories have gained widespread acceptance in mainstream linguistics. By 3,500 BCE, the Sumerian settlement pattern had coalesced into something unprecedented: the city-state. Uruk, the jewel in the crown of Sumerian achievement, grew dramatically during this period. By around 3,100 BCE, estimates suggest the city housed between 40,000 and 80,000 residents within and around its walls, though exact population figures remain debated among scholars. To put this in perspective, while Uruk bustled with tens of thousands of inhabitants, most human settlements elsewhere consisted of a few dozen families at most. During the late Uruk period, the city covered approximately 250 hectares and would eventually expand even further. It was dominated by massive temple complexes that rose toward the heavens. At its heart stood the White Temple atop the Anu ziggurat, a gleaming beacon visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. This wasn't just a large village. It was humanity's first true city, complete with specialized workers, social hierarchy, centralized administration, and monumental architecture. But Uruk didn't stand alone. By the 3rd millennium BCE, at least a dozen major Sumerian city-states dotted the landscape: Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, Umma, Adab, and others. Each functioned as an independent political entity, controlling its own surrounding farmland and villages. These city-states shared a common culture, language, and religious tradition, yet they remained fiercely autonomous. Political power in early Sumer rested with priest-kings called Ensi, religious leaders who claimed to represent the gods while managing earthly affairs. They oversaw temple economies, organized labor for public works, and adjudicated disputes. As rivalries intensified between city-states, a new figure emerged: the Lugal, or secular king, who commanded armies and expanded territories through conquest. The most successful Lugals established dynasties that would be remembered for millennia, their names carefully recorded in what became known as the Sumerian King List, a document that mixed historical rulers with mythological figures in a chronology that spanned from the creation of kingship itself through the Great Flood and into historical times. The most transformative Sumerian innovation, however, wasn't architectural or political. It was representational: the invention of writing. Around 3500 BCE, Sumerian merchants and temple administrators faced a growing problem. Their economic activities had become too complex to track through memory alone. Trade networks stretched across hundreds of miles. Temple storehouses held vast quantities of grain, oil, and manufactured goods. Taxation systems required precise accounting. The solution emerged gradually, beginning with simple clay tokens pressed into soft clay to record transactions. These tokens evolved into pictographs, simple drawings representing physical objects. A picture of a sheep meant a sheep. A picture of grain meant grain. But pictographic writing had severe limitations. How do you draw an abstract concept like justice or yesterday? How do you express grammar, tense, or relationship between ideas? The breakthrough came with the realization that symbols could represent sounds as well as objects. This rebus principle transformed writing from a simple accounting tool into a system capable of recording the full complexity of human thought and speech. By 2600 BCE, cuneiform writing had matured into a sophisticated script combining logograms, which represented whole words or concepts, with phonograms, which represented syllables and sounds. Scribes used reed styluses cut at an angle to press wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, which were then dried in the sun or fired in kilns to preserve them permanently. The word cuneiform itself comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, a reference to these distinctive triangular impressions. Thousands of these tablets have survived, providing an unparalleled window into Sumerian life. They record everything from mundane receipts for barley rations to mathematical calculations, legal contracts, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, royal decrees, and great works of literature. Creating these tablets required specialized training. Sumerian society developed the world's first formal schools called edubas, or tablet houses, where young scribes spent years mastering the hundreds of signs in the cuneiform script. Students practiced by copying standard texts, creating exercise tablets that could be smoothed and reused. Only the most important documents, such as temple archives and royal inscriptions, were fired to make them permanent. The education was rigorous and often harsh, with strict discipline and corporal punishment for mistakes. But those who completed this training joined an elite class of literate professionals who formed the administrative backbone of Sumerian civilization. They became not just scribes, but accountants, priests, judges, teachers, and advisors to kings. Rising above every Sumerian city, dominating the skyline and organizing urban space, stood the ziggurat. These massive stepped pyramids served as both temples and cosmic mountains, artificial peaks in a flatland where natural elevation was scarce. The Sumerians believed their gods descended from the heavens to dwell in these sacred structures, making them literal bridges between the mortal and divine realms. Constructing a ziggurat required extraordinary engineering skill and vast labor forces. The structure began with a massive platform of sun-dried mud bricks, faced with fired bricks set in bitumen for waterproofing and stability. Each successive tier was smaller than the one below, creating a stepped profile that could rise to heights of 40 feet or more. The Ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BCE by King Ur-Nammu, stands as the best preserved example. Its lowest tier originally measured 210 feet by 150 feet at the base and rose approximately 64 feet high. 3 monumental staircases led to the summit, where a temple dedicated to Nana, the moon god, awaited those priests granted access to the divine presence. The general population never climbed these steps. Ziggurats weren't public worship spaces, but exclusive residences for deities, attended only by high priests who performed elaborate rituals, prepared sacred meals, and interpreted divine will. The limited access served a practical purpose as well. With only a few guarded stairways leading upward, the temple treasuries and sacred spaces could be protected from theft and unauthorized intrusion. Some scholars suggest the elevated platforms also offered protection during seasonal flooding, lifting the most sacred spaces above the rising waters that periodically inundated the Mesopotamian plain. Binding all Sumerian life together was a complex religious worldview, populated by hundreds, perhaps thousands, of deities. The Sumerian pantheon reflected both natural forces and social organization, with gods and goddesses governing everything from cosmic phenomena to specific cities and occupations. At the apex stood An, the sky god, lord of the heavens and supreme deity, though his direct intervention in human affairs was limited. His son Enlil, god of wind and storms, took a more active role, separating heaven from earth at creation and serving as king of the gods. Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and magic, was credited with creating humanity and serving as mankind's protector. Ninhursag, the earth goddess, governed fertility and childbirth. The moon god Nana and his son Utu, the sun god of justice, represented the celestial bodies that ordered time and seasons. But the most beloved deity was Inanna, goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and war. She embodied divine paradox, both nurturing and destructive, sensual and violent. More hymns, prayers, and stories survive about Inanna than any other Sumerian deity. Her most famous myth describes her descent into the underworld, where her sister Ereshkigal ruled over the dead. There, Inanna died and was hung from a hook like a piece of meat, only to be resurrected through the intervention of her father Enki, though at terrible cost. Her lover Dumuzi had to take her place for half the year, creating the cycle of seasons as he descended and returned. The Sumerians imagined the universe as a flat earth covered by a domed sky, surrounded by a primordial saltwater ocean. Beneath the earth lay the underworld, Kur, a gloomy realm of shadows where all souls went after death, regardless of their earthly deeds. Unlike later religions that promised heavenly rewards for virtue, Sumerian afterlife beliefs were democratic in their bleakness. King and commoner alike descended to the same dusty realm, their comfort dependent entirely on whether living relatives continued to make offerings at their graves. The gods themselves were anthropomorphic beings with human forms, emotions, appetites, and flaws. They needed food, which priests provided through daily offerings. They could be pleased or angered, capricious or reliable. They assembled in councils to debate cosmic matters, mirroring the political assemblies of human city-states. If writing gave the Sumerians the ability to record and transmit knowledge, their practical innovations gave them the power to reshape their environment. The wheel, one of humanity's most fundamental technologies, emerged in Sumer around 3500 BCE, initially not for transportation but for pottery production. The potter's wheel allowed mass manufacture of ceramic vessels, democratizing access to storage containers, cooking pots, and ceremonial objects. Only later, around 3000 BCE, did Sumerians adapt the wheel for carts and wagons, revolutionizing overland transport. Their early wheels were solid wooden discs, heavy and cumbersome, but effective for moving goods across flat terrain. Agriculture, always the foundation of civilization, received particular attention. The Sumerians developed sophisticated irrigation systems involving canals, dikes, levees, and reservoirs that tamed the unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. They built these waterworks on a scale unprecedented in human history, transforming seasonally flooded marshland into year-round productive farmland. They invented the seed plow, a device that simultaneously broke ground and planted seeds at proper depth and spacing, dramatically increasing agricultural efficiency. They even wrote farming manuals preserved on clay tablets, providing detailed instructions for different crops, proper irrigation schedules, and prayers to agricultural deities. In mathematics, the Sumerians developed a base 60 sexagesimal number system that still influences us today. We divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds because of Sumerian mathematical conventions. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, a number easily divisible by many factors, making geometric calculations more manageable. Their mathematical knowledge extended to geometry, arithmetic, and even early forms of algebra, all developed to serve practical needs: surveying land, calculating areas, determining volumes for storage containers, and tracking astronomical cycles for their lunar calendar. From this fertile cultural soil grew literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving great works of literature, has its roots in Sumerian oral traditions and early Sumerian poems about the king of Uruk. The story follows Gilgamesh, who was indeed a historical king of Uruk, on his quest for immortality after the death of his beloved friend Enkidu. It's an exploration of friendship, mortality, the meaning of legacy, and humanity's relationship with the divine. The epic began as separate Sumerian poems and songs that were later compiled and evolved into the integrated Babylonian epic more familiar to modern readers. When archaeologists discovered tablets containing the story in the 19th century, its flood narrative caused considerable discussion due to its striking similarities to the biblical story of Noah, demonstrating the deep interconnectedness of ancient Near Eastern traditions. But Gilgamesh represented only one strand in a rich literary tradition. Sumerians produced hymns to gods and kings, wisdom literature, proverbs, legal documents including the Code of Ur-Nammu from around 2100 to 2050 BCE, which scholars recognize as one of history's earliest surviving law codes, lamentations over destroyed cities, and myths explaining cosmic origins. These texts reveal a sophisticated culture grappling with timeless questions. What does it mean to be human? What are our obligations to gods and to each other? How should we face our mortality? What constitutes a life well lived? Sumerian society was hierarchical, organized into distinct classes with different rights and obligations. At the top stood the ruling class: kings, high priests, and temple administrators who controlled vast wealth and wielded supreme political and religious authority. Below them were the Awilu, free citizens who included merchants, artisans, lower-ranking priests, and independent farmers. These individuals could own property, engage in commerce, and had legal protections. The Mushkenu formed a middle tier, semi-free individuals who might work for temples or palaces, receiving rations rather than owning land. At the bottom were slaves, people captured in war, sold for debt, or born into servitude. While slavery existed, It was generally less brutal than later systems, with some legal protections and paths to eventual freedom. Economic life centered on temple complexes, which functioned as massive redistribution centers. Temples owned vast agricultural lands worked by laborers who received rations of grain, oil, and wool. Temple workshops produced textiles, pottery, metalwork, and other goods. Scribes meticulously tracked every transaction on clay tablets, creating detailed archives that modern scholars study to understand Sumerian economics. Private commerce flourished alongside temple economies, with merchants trading locally and across vast distances. Sumerian trade networks reached the Indus Valley, bringing back lapis lazuli, carnelian, timber, and exotic goods. Ships sailed down the Persian Gulf to Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha, mysterious lands that supplied the raw materials Sumer lacked. Around 2350 BCE, the Akkadian king Sargon conquered Sumer, uniting the region under Semitic rule and establishing history's first empire. Though Sumerian political independence ended, Sumerian culture survived. The Akkadians adopted cuneiform writing, absorbed Sumerian religious beliefs, and preserved Sumerian literature. After the Akkadian Empire collapsed, Sumer experienced a brief renaissance under the Third Dynasty of Ur around 2100 BCE, but invasions by Elamites and Amorites in the following centuries ended Sumerian political power forever. The Sumerian language gradually ceased to be spoken, surviving only as a scholarly and liturgical tongue, much like Latin in medieval Europe. By 1800, Sumerian as a living language had vanished. Yet Sumerian influence never died. Every civilization that followed in Mesopotamia, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, built upon Sumerian foundations. Cuneiform writing spread across the Near East, adapted to write Akkadian, Hittite, Elamite, and other languages. Sumerian mathematical and astronomical knowledge passed to the Greeks and then to Islamic scholars, eventually reaching Renaissance Europe. Elements of Sumerian mythology appear in the Hebrew Bible, in Greek myths, in stories told today. The Code of Hammurabi, though Babylonian, drew heavily on earlier Sumerian legal traditions. The very concept of urban civilization, of cities as centers of culture, commerce, and power, began in Sumer. Standing here today, thousands of years removed from Sumerian glory, we live in their shadow. When you check the time in hours, minutes, and seconds, you're using Sumerian mathematics. When you read words on a page, you're employing a technology they pioneered. The laws that govern our societies, the cities we inhabit, the schools where we educate our children, all echo institutions first developed between the Tigris and Euphrates. The Sumerians asked fundamental questions about existence, mortality, justice, and meaning, questions we still grapple with today. They weren't alien or primitive. They were us, at the dawn, taking the first bold steps toward the world we now inhabit. If this journey into humanity's first civilization moved you, if you felt that connection across the millennia, hit that like button and let us know. Subscribe to the Codex of History for more deep dives into the forgotten stories that shaped our world. Drop a comment below. What aspect of Sumerian civilization surprised you most? What do you want to explore next? Because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we became who we are, and the Sumerians show us exactly where that journey began.